Welcome back. So, we got a brand new Sacred Stones banner coming out relatively soon, and they also announced an Arcane Bow alongside it. And just like every other Arcane, it has a lot of effects that you could give to pretty much any unit of your choosing. And also, I figured it'd be worth talking about in the video, as I did with pretty much every other Arcane. If you're looking to give it to somebody in particular and you don't really have any sense of direction and what you want to do with it, this video is going to help you figure out exactly what you want to do with it. Or at the very least, give you a direction to go in with the Arcane in mind. Although before we do the initial breakdown of the weapon, I do want to quickly talk about today's sponsor.
We don't have any plans at the moment to do PC. Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Well, I sure do. And what a good time to have one thanks to today's sponsor, Awesome Remote. Awesome Remote allows you to control your PC and play PC games remotely from your own mobile device. Remote Desktop is a fast, stable, and reliable way to remotely access your PC through something like a phone, a tablet, or another PC, and this can be used to control or troubleshoot the computers in question through your device. It's available on Windows, iOS, and Android, and it's free. Actually, well, there is one barrier of entry. You gotta have a phone. That being said, the program is free, and the coolest part about it is that it works both ways, as in you can either play mobile games on your PC or play PC games on your phone. It's rather flexible in that regard and makes it much more vastly appealing. They also have paid options if you do want to shell out a few bucks for additional features. The benefit to paying a bit of money for the extended program is that you can get stuff like remote control for Android devices, and you can enjoy more stable and faster connections in general. Likewise, there's a smart power plug which you can actually get as an extension for the program, so you don't necessarily need to keep your computer on all the time. You can still do remote access through your phone as a result of it. Just one tap to wake it up, one tap to shut it down, and put it on your phone and you're good to go. However, if you would rather try it out first, they have the free option, so you may as well give it a shot. Thanks to Awesome Remote for sponsoring the video. The Arcane Bow, with a name I'm not going to try and pronounce because I'm pretty sure I'm going to butcher it, has a sliding effect with a guaranteed follow-up, Spectrum 5, so pretty much your standard stuff from all the other Arcanes. Although what makes this bow stand out in particular is that it has first hit damage reduction, which to my memory is the first Arcane of its kind that has any sort of damage reduction built into it, and it also grants additional attack based off the foe's max special cooldown count, for a minimum of 4 additional attack, which is really nice. I find that comparatively to a lot of the Arcanes that we have, the 30% damage reduction on the first hit can leverage a lot more build opportunities despite it being on an archetype that doesn't really have a lot of skill inheritance. Although infantry aside, this is mainly because it isn't just locked to the player phase or enemy phase, but rather you can get damage reduction on both phases depending on whether or not you can meet the condition, which for 2023 standards is just going to be within 2 spaces, which is basically free. However, for general damage output, you can easily make a comparison to something that is readily accessible through Grails in the form of Whitecap. I do think this is worth bringing up since Whitecap and Arcane, at the end of the day, you're going to be trying to kill the opponent. That's basically how the whole thing goes. Although you could still use Arcane for damage reduction properties, maybe for like far saves or near saves, but generally if you're going to be entering combat like this, you're more than likely going to be trying to secure kills, in which case I do think the comparison is definitely warranted, especially if you don't necessarily know whether or not you want to go and summon for Arcane when you already have Whitecap on your unit. And in my opinion, there's 2 things worth considering if you do want to use Whitecap over Arcane, and that's whether or not you're using it on the catch your ball team, so, you know, with your standard player phase brave attacks, and if the unit you're using it on is moderately fast, because unlike Arcane, the Whitecap does require 10 speed over the foe, which isn't exactly the worst for a lot of modern units, but if you're going to be using it on maybe someone like your favorite that may have workable speed but isn't exactly the fastest, you may find that they're going to be struggling against a lot more modern threats. And if both of those considerations are taken into account, you may prefer something like Whitecap over Arcane. However, unlike Whitecap, Arcane can pretty much be used on any kind of unit. The innate slaying makes it so you can trigger specials much more easily, especially on other movement types that don't have access to stuff like Time's Pulse, where you can easily manipulate specials that way. It has first hit damage reduction, so if you do need to take a hit, it's entirely possible. And because of the nature of Arcanes in most scenarios, it can work in both the player phase and the enemy phase, where Whitecap only works in the player phase. However, unlike Whitecap, Arcane is still prone to stuff like no follow-up, hardy fighter, or anything that could just generally shut down your guaranteed follow-up, which may not necessarily be the worst in some scenarios where if you have a slow armor, it's probably not going to make a difference one way or the other, since chances are you're really going to be using that for tanking over your damage output. However, for units attempting the player phase against something that has far save and maybe follow-up denial with hardy fighter, it's going to prove to be more of an issue. Although if you have no follow-up support, then it may not necessarily be there, but at that point it's just a lot of semantics and just a lot of scenarios. But point being, if you want something that has a lot more potential in the player phase, I find that Whitecap is going to be doing you a lot better, although it does require a fair amount of speed to use. However, if you want something that's a bit more flexible and something that you could put on a lot more units, then I would argue that the Arcane is going to be a lot better for you. That being said, you can still use the Arcane on any fast unit in particular, and you can still get moderately good success out of it. So for example, if you want to give it to someone like Etier, who, if I remember correctly, is our most recent bow demote, she has a really good offensive stat spread and is easily mergeable and easy to build up because she is a demote. You could give her Arcane with something like ×+4 and Moonbow, alongside attack speed, finish, and guard. So when Etier enters combat, not only is she going to be able to get extra damage from finish and constant Moonbow triggers, but she'll also be able to get a fair amount of damage reduction from her weapon and guard 4, so that her sustainability is extremely high. And while she does have the no follow-up seal equipped, you could always replace it with something like Blade Session or anything that boosts attack and speed, and then run no follow-up support through maybe Infantry Speed Tactic or no follow or anything of the sort, so that she could further bolster her combative prowess. Although if you want to continually stack up damage reduction, you can with the line of remote skills. By giving any sort of fast bow unit the Arcane with remote Sparrow and guard, you're going to be getting a lot of first hit damage reduction, which can mean a lot for just general sustainability. Although it is worth mentioning that if you do have to take a second hit, you're not going to be getting damage reduction on the second hit. So it is imperative that you do have some sort of ability to shut off the foe's ability to double. But otherwise, you could continually stack up their attack and speed, maybe with something like Oath 4, so you could also get the warping potential and Blade Session for a really good amount of attack and speed from there, especially if they aren't the one to act first. Otherwise, as aforementioned, you can put somebody on a Catria Ball and run speed defense tempo, or any sort of tempo that works with their playstyle, with the Arcane and ×+4, so that they can always get Deadeye on the second hit, which means that if you were going up against something that has instant hardy fighter, which is more often the case than not, you'll be able to get Deadeye on the second hit, which is really, really good. There are going to be some units that just have an absurd amount of defense and res, such as Brave Edelgard, but I'm certain that if you were to give this to any sort of high attack bow unit, you'll do fine in the end. And it's worth mentioning that if the foe isn't able to shut down your own guaranteed follow-up, it doesn't matter if you're fast or slow, you'll be able to quad because you get the Brave and Guaranteed Follow-Up paired with it. And that really just covers player phase builds for the most part. You could also try something for the enemy phase, although your success rate with it will ultimately vary depending on who you go up against. For example, if you wanted to try making somebody into a physical nuker with Close Reversal and Special Spiral 4, with ×Pulse in tow, you'll be able to get a instant Luna after the foe lands their first hit. Although it is worth mentioning that if they do reduce your HP by a significant amount on the first attack, and you have to enter consecutive battles, it might be worth using something like Soth so that you could at least get some form of sustainability. But again, it will ultimately depend on the matchup you go up against. Some of them are just going to be really brutal no matter what. You could also try to make somebody into a ranged tank with something like Distant Defense 4, Mystic Boost 4, and Attack Smoke 4. So with the Arcane granting a guaranteed follow-up, Attack Smoke 4 preventing follow-ups in general, and the no follow-up seal, unless the foe has no follow-up themselves, they won't be able to double, and you can secure your own doubles yourself. Although it is worth mentioning that no follow-up is fairly common nowadays, especially in more competitive mode, since they just keep giving it out like candy. And that's really about it when it comes to the infantry builds. Next, I want to go over the armor builds, because I do think there's a fair amount of stuff worth discussing, although comparatively to the infantry, it's probably going to be a bit lacking. Ranged armors in particular aren't exactly great when it comes to far save purposes, because there's so many effects that just pierce through damage reduction or just do an absurd amount of damage, on top of the BST cut that they do receive because they are ranged. More often than not, you're probably running a one ranged unit for far save purposes over your ranged armors. That being said, I do think the Arcane does make it a bit more manageable because it does have first hit damage reduction. So if you were able to speed stack on someone like Felix or Ignatz, then you could potentially get out an instant Deadeye, and with Special Fighter 4, you can keep your sustainability relatively high, since you do get healing from your special, which is really, really good. Although it is worth mentioning that anything with any sort of instant Deadeye, lethality, Special Spiral 4, or if the foe is on a Catria ball and they're able to get their Deadeye off that way, it's going to still prove pretty fatal. However, if you did still want to use the Arcane for damage reduction purposes on ranged armors, it might be a good idea to make them into a near save. And that's mainly due to the fact that you're less likely going to run into stuff that pierces through damage reduction as a melee specialist or anything that works against one ranged foes, as opposed to two ranged threats. As such, I do think if you were to run this on maybe someone like Felix or Ignatz, you might be better off running them as a near save and then giving them Savvy Fighter so that they can get additional damage reduction from their B slot and no follow-up, meaning that they can always secure their own damage output and they can tank relatively well as long as the foe isn't going to double. And chances are, most foes aren't really going to do that from near. Now granted, there are units that are still going to prove troubling. You have Brave Selef, who is extremely fast. You have Brave Crumb, who can take advantage of all sorts of buffs and penalties and all that stuff and get an absurd amount of speed on top of armor effectiveness. And then you have stuff like Legendary Nana and Spring Carla, who could just pierce through any sort of damage reduction, especially the former, who doesn't need to get it off on a special. That being said, you can still run this on slower units, especially the ones that are a lot more min-max. So if you were to give this to somebody like Winter Annette, who is extremely min-maxed in nature, give them something like Distant Defense 4 with Seal Attack 4 and a Far Save, chances are they're going to be shrugging off a lot of damage. And the reason why I don't have a Fighter 4 in the B slot is because the Arcane already provides a guaranteed follow-up. And if the foe already has no follow-up anyway, then you're more than likely going to get more mileage out of Seal Attack 4 over any other fighter. That on top of the first hit damage reduction, by running something like a Deflect, whether that's missile or magic, you'll be able to shrug off a fair amount of damage, especially if the foe doesn't have the ability to get their special off thanks to Seal Attack 4's innate guard. And again, you could still run them as a near save since you're not really going to be running the risk of any sort of damage reduction. And if you have somebody that's very defense and or res heavy, it doesn't really have to be both, but it might be preferable since dragons are becoming more and more common, especially on an Aetherite's defense setting. You could always run something like Special Fighter 4 with Deadeye and Close Reversal, so that way you could heal back a lot of the damage that you potentially took on top of having an instant Deadeye ready to go. This can make it so that you're easily able to take out a lot more foes at one range. But again, if you run into something like Legendary Nana or Brave Selef, it's going to be a bit more of an issue. Beyond the armors, you have the Cavalry. And the Cavalry are definitely going to be a bit more limited comparatively to the other two because armors and infantry just get everything for some reason, but at least they're not ranged flyers, and we'll get into that in a bit. So the Cavalry can do a fair amount of stuff for what it's worth because they do have access to stuff like Far Trace and Escape Route, and while the other units can use it too, I find that they're going to be using it a lot better comparatively because they have the extended range to use it well, especially comparatively to ranged flyers who only have 2 and more than likely aren't going to be able to retreat after combat. Regardless, if you did want to take advantage of the Arcane a bit more, you could always try something with a Water Sweep or Wind Sweep, especially if your Cavalry are defense lopsided. So for example, if you wanted to give it to somebody like Python, he was relatively known as having a really good defense set at the time, and for what it's worth, it's not necessarily bad nowadays, but it could still be a bit better. That being said, the Arcane providing 30% damage reduction on the first hit, as well as being able to use stuff like Remote Sparrow, it's definitely going to be a lot easier to shrug off first hit damage, especially with a good defense stat like his. And because the Arcane does provide a guaranteed follow-up, if you're able to outspeed the foe with Water Sweep, then you're going to be able to double no matter what, which is really, really good. However, it is worth mentioning that depending on the role you set him in, some units are just going to be naturally faster, especially the modern threats. So it may not necessarily be as good, but it can still check stuff like Ninja Camilla or a lot of other notable threats that are covered by Water Sweep. Otherwise, you could just continually stack up attack and speed with the likes of Remote Sparrow, Far Trace, and Speed Smoke 4. So that way you can have first hit damage reduction in your initial combat in the player phase, and if you have to potentially take a hit in the enemy phase, although it's ill-advised, you'll have a better shot at doing it thanks to Speed Smoke 4 and the Arcane still providing damage reduction regardless of the phase, as long as you're able to meet the condition, which I think is really, really beneficial. Otherwise, you could try this one gimmicky set that just attempts to set up stuff like Pathfinder, making your threat range a lot bigger. So with the Arcane providing 30% damage reduction on the first hit, combining that with Remote Mirror, Escape Route 4, and Defense Res Smoke 3, if you are able to survive a combat with them, you will be able to cancel back out one space, and set up Pathfinder, meaning that allies can swoop in and take kills much more easily. And if the foe isn't able to counter, then you could still use Fury 3 to set up Escape Route 4 after combat, since it does require the unit to be below 100% HP. If you are able to set up Pathfinder like that, then your threat range will become exponentially bigger. And last but certainly not least, we have the Flier Builds, which are definitely going to be the most limited because ranged flyers get nothing good for some reason. So there are a couple things you can attempt, whether that's trying to make a mixed phase threat with something like Preempt, or securing a Deadeye with the likes of Heavy Blade, Attack, Defense, Rain, and the Arcane. And I'll go into that one in a bit because I do think that's probably the most interesting build here. So quickly going over the Preempt build, the idea is just to mainly have some sort of mixed phase potential, whether that's initiating combat, getting a Deadeye off there, and then if you have to take a hit through a ranged threat, you have the ability to use Speed Preempt if you are able to outspeed, which I don't think is necessarily going to be the biggest issue, especially if you are running something like Attack Speed, Unity, and Oath, meaning that any sort of penalty or panic to the user will make it easier to get your speed check going, especially since Speed Preempt gives the user a 4-point stat swing. However, I would advise running this with Gilliam, who is our newest and latest armor, who has a PRF that grants drive IOTs, or I guess more accurately, grants visible IOTs to every flyer at the start of a turn, which is really good. And since he already has a near save build ready out of the gate, it's a really good pairing just for any sort of fast range flyer like this, especially if they're going to be using the Arcane. And then otherwise, you could still try and do something with the player phase, especially if you were to pair them with a Catria Ball. Normally, Heavy Blade checks are notoriously difficult to get off because attack is just continually raising every single banner, on top of the fact that just bases and just all the other passive effects that come with PRFs just grants a massive stat swing there. However, because the Arcane can grant an exuberant amount of additional attack depending on the foe's special, ranging from a minimum of 4 points to what could easily be 8 or even higher depending on the right situation, by pairing it up with something like Attack, Defense, Rain, you'll more than likely make an attack check comparatively to a lot of other units, especially since Attack, Defense, Rain debuffs the foe for 4 attack, whereas you would otherwise have to run something like Joint Drive Attack, at which point you also do lose out on a fair amount of tanking potential, especially if you aren't using it on a Catria Ball. And as far as notable builds go, I find that these are probably some of the better ones worth highlighting. And before closing off the video, I do want to briefly talk about the units that you might want to give this to comparatively to a lot of other ones. Unsurprisingly, a lot of them are in the replace weapon category because either they have no weapon to call their own, they're seasonal locked, meaning that they're probably never going to get a PRF, or they just have an outdated PRF not worth using anymore. You'll find that a lot of bow units just fill that category for the most part. So even stuff like Brave Lyn, who does have Sakei's Blessing, which is still okay for what it's worth, I do find that you're better off running something like Seal Defense 4 or Seal Speed 4, or whatever the case may be, so that her damage output is a lot more consistent than just potentially dealing damage to something that can't counterattack anyway. And then for the rest of the bow unit, it either boils down to units that could make use of it, or units that you just do not want to give it to for one reason or the other. For the can go either way category, it's all just going to be support. Kenshi Knight, Hinoka, and Virion, while Virion isn't exactly a worthwhile or notable support unit in general, he still does have a sudden panic bow, so if you did want to keep him as support, you don't really want to give him the Arcane for it, but if you did want to build him for combat, then you're probably better off doing that. Same thing really for Kenshi Knight Hinoka. Her combat isn't exactly the greatest, but if you did want to make her into something that is just more than support, then you can absolutely go ham with it. And the dancers themselves aren't really going to be able to take advantage of it whatsoever because they don't really have access to skills that would allow them to leverage off the Arcane out to the pure combat, which you can still do, but if you're looking to keep them as just dancer support, it's not going to make a difference one way or the other. Meanwhile, in the don't replace category, you have units that got really good refines, some units that you probably don't want to drop the bow for because it either hinders their ability as a support unit or their combat prowess, or just modern units that are really good as is. So stuff like Dual Legion, who has a dual phase brave slaying weapon, you absolutely do not want to get rid of her weapon because it's just objectively better in every scenario. Or even stuff like Legendary Crom or Legendary Lucina. I don't really think Legendary Lucina's remix was that good, and while you can give her the Arcane to make her a bit better in combat, I find that losing out on Future Vision is probably not going to be the way to go, especially since by giving her the Arcane, you do lose out on Future Vision too, and you do lose out on potential scoring, which if you still value that is going to be worthwhile anyway. And while Legendary Crom I would have put in the wait for refine category, I do think even though his weapon and his just general combat prowess is really mediocre nowadays, to change fate can still be a really good multi-purpose skill that a lot of units would absolutely appreciate, even if it's just for the additional movement. And that's going to be the general gist when it comes to don't replace. Otherwise, you just have the 2 units in the wait for refine category, which is pretty self-explanatory. Igren is book 3, and we are closing out on book 3 refines relatively soon, so she could get a refine pretty much at any time. And because of that, I don't think it's worth giving you the Arcane just yet. If it turns out that her refine is just really bad, then go nuts. But for now, I do think it's worth holding out for. And Eleanor, if I remember correctly, she did follow Igren in the following book, and she was one of the first additions in said book, which is why I don't think you necessarily want to give it to her either. And for what it's worth, if you can still make speed checks with her weapon, the fire sweep effect can still go a long way. And other than that, that's really going to be about it for the Arcane video. Let me know if you do end up pulling for the bow, because I don't really know how many people are really interested in this banner overall. I don't think I'm going to personally summon on it because I have Whitecap, and I don't think I need the Arcane for a lot of other stuff. But if you do end up pulling for it, let me know who you want to put it on. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.